good news things in that budget is a little over $1 billion in cuts to corrections with some good programs and changing some of the things Bob mentioned. But let me just start with, I was in the Assembly for 2 years, got elected to the Senate. When I was going over to the Senate, the then leader of the Senate, Senator Parada, suggested that I take over the budget committee that had control over general government and corrections. And he was sort of funny about why he thought I should do that. One was he thought I was either courageous or not very bright, so that I would take the assignment. I prefer to think I'm courageous, but I know my limits of my intellect. And I decided to do that. And it's been, because I thought, ironically at the time, I thought, well, I've got 4 years, my first term, and under term limits, if I get elected a second time, I have another 4 years, and here's an issue that, for me at least, some of the real richness of being a politician is going into complicated areas like this that don't get a lot of political support, but you could actually go out of politics knowing that you did something to change it. And it's so clear to anyone, obviously Bob's presentation, but it's so clear that what we are doing is ridiculously ineffective on any level. And probably most obvious is a comment I had from the former warden, he's now retired, at San Quentin, who was the warden at Pelican Bay, spent 40 years in the departments of correction, and he said, Mark, our system is failing on the most basic thing that it's supposed to do. It's not protecting the public, it's actually making them more at risk. And the simple reason for that, as you can see very clearly, when you go and see the facilities, tomorrow night I go speak to a large group of people who work in the prison but are not in the California Corrections Department. They're the non-custodial staff, the psychologists, the counselors, and they're amazing to speak with. We don't have enough of them, as was mentioned in the previous report. But we take people basically into the California prison system. 80% of the people in the prison system, the statistic I heard when I first took this budget committee, and by the way, at the back, if you want to get some more reading, there is the agenda from our last budget committee meeting on March 19th of this year that went over just the budget of the Corrections Department. So correct, it's almost $10 billion, about $8.5 billion of that goes to adults, the other is for the California Youth Authority, which actually has had some reforms I'll talk to you about. For the adult population, it's almost $50,000 a year on average. For the young people who unfortunately are still in the California Youth Authority, it's about $250,000 a year to incarcerate them. This budget, the budget in the Corrections Department is $10 million. It's with financing and also the vehicle license fee transfer. Those are the three areas in the budget that have grown beyond the cost of living. Everything else is sort of tracked in the state budget. The California Department of Corrections now spends more than the budgets of the California State University System and the University of California combined. Their budgets are about $8 billion. So it's the third largest prison system that I've been told of in the world, behind China and the US and then China as a whole. And 80% of the prisoners have mental health and substance abuse problems. 20% are people, in most people's view, are people who have done really bad things and need to be incarcerated to protect the public and generally themselves. So the 80% are the ones that go back in and out. So our recidivism rate, the most recent statistic, was 73%. If you look at other large states, it's under 30%. New York is around 25%, Florida, New Jersey, even Texas has lower recidivism rate. And for a variety of reasons, some of them already stated in terms of the political aspect, which is actually right on. And it actually came, for those of us who remember when George W. Bush beat Michael Dukakis, the famous Willie Horton commercial, and I'll talk a little bit more about that because the solutions to the problem are not that complicated. It's the politics of getting to them. And we have multiple expert panels, well, the expert panel with multiple reports that show us what other states have done. And most importantly, what other states do, of the people in the California prison system, almost 80% of them cannot read at a high school level, and almost a quarter of them are functionally illiterate. Well, we used to provide literacy programs in prison. We used to supply vocational training in prison. We still do, but it's very limited. And we used to have more robust, in terms of percentage of the problem, substance abuse and mental health responses. especially when you compare us to other states. So what did New York do that their recidivism rate is 25%, 28%, and ours 73%? Well, in addition to the sentencing requirements, and also that we're the only state that has mandatory sentencing and then has mandatory parole for 3 years. So what happens to these folks is the 73%, 2/3 of them come back in within the first, 1/3 comes back within the first 30 days, another third comes in the next 30 days. And what they fail on is a technicality, or they test dirty on their alcohol or drug tests. We actually have multiple anecdotal situations of parole officers ignoring the law in somewhat heroic fashion, in my view, where they have caseloads who have come out of prison, have gone back in multiple times because they've tested dirty. They might come out, as this warden said to me, he said, why is it any surprise to you or anyone else that we get these folks in? They're from areas of poverty, they have mental health issues, depression, naturally, and then they self-medicate. And why is it any surprise we get them somewhat stabilized when they're in incarceration, but when they go out, they have to wait 3 to 6 months in this county if they're diagnosed that they need a residential treatment facility? Well, we let them out, and they need to be in a residential treatment facility, but there aren't enough beds. So what happens is they get $200, that's what the warden said. Why is it a surprise we give someone like that $200, send them back into Hunters Point or Richmond or Oakland, into poverty where there's lots of drugs? Why are we surprised that within 30 days they test dirty and they come back in? So what parole officers will do, they see somebody starting to make some headway, someone gets a job, but they drink on the weekend. They test dirty, they don't submit the test. Which in some of the anecdotal stories I actually think is quite admirable, because they know that this person, if they're going to get better, that's the way they should get better. So, for instance, in New York, we actually, Arnold hired a woman who ran the alcohol and drug department, the public health department in New York, Renee Zito, who I've become friends with. And what they did in New York was they started to build up more mental health and substance abuse programs in the prison, but equally or probably more important is when they get out. So that when someone gets out and you know they have these issues and these challenges, you're giving them counseling, outpatient counseling if that's what the analysis is, residential treatment if they need that, and they're also getting job training. Well, this isn't rocket science. This is what we did for years and years in this state and what we should be doing now. I had a bill this year that would increase the taxes on alcohol, nickel a drink. I tried to stay away from the wine industry because they're powerful and they're having their own struggles, and to be honest, they do provide an economic benefit, particularly in Northern California. But I couldn't get that bill out of the first committee because I couldn't get Democrats to vote for it. And all I wanted, that would have generated about $800 million for substance abuse programs. We are 49th out of 50 states in our taxes on alcohol. So these other states have actually taken that. And you know, I've had fights. I used to be in the liquor business, so some of the people in the liquor industry were mad at me for introducing the bill. And I understand their concerns, particularly in this economic downturn. But we need revenue to get these programs. And personally, as somebody who used to be a liquor license holder, I think I had a responsibility for making money off of this to supply something back for people who unfortunately abuse the product. So that's those are the simple answers. We have, as we speak, in this budget, which is a horrific budget, and I'll finish with the most depressing part of the conversation, but also an opportunity to change that, and I'd be happy to answer questions. So, in this environment where you think you really should put more money into prevention and intervention rather than crisis, we have been unable to do that. The governor actually has been reasonably good back and forth on corrections, mostly because he's mad at the correctional officers union, because they opposed him. If you oppose the governor, generally he
terminates
I have a camera on, but I'm already in trouble with him anyways. He tends to be very petulant. Movie stars apparently aren't used to disagreement, which is not, you know, if you go to politics, you get used to the fact that people disagree with you. The Correctional Officers Union, to be perfectly honest, overplayed their hand. There seems to always be some group in Sacramento and probably in Washington that get too much power and they start using it in a way that is detrimental to their cause as well. They have a legitimate cause in the sense that it's not a very nice job. Most of us wouldn't want to do it. But it needs to be changed. So in this budget, we will actually, depending on what happens in the discussions tonight, over this weekend and probably Monday and Tuesday, we will cut about $1 billion, about a tenth of the budget out of the Department of Corrections. We will release about 25,000 to 35,000 prisoners who are low-maintenance prisoners. We will take some of the savings and put more oversight at high-risk parolees so they actually get seen more frequently by parole officers. There's one suggestion, which I think is a good one, which would take most of the parole functions and put them in county probation. We've pretty much done this with juveniles, and it's worked. Probation officers are in the community. There's resistance to that because, politically, to be honest, because the parole agents are part of the California Correctional Officers Union. But we have to overcome that. It's been a suggestion by a legislative analyst office every year, the 3 years I've been there. So we will do those things. We will actually give credit for the early release. So if you've behaved well in your time in prison, and if you've gone to either vocational training where it's available, and for treatment and you've done it well, you'll get credit for early release. And then the danger, though, of course, is when people get out, because we haven't done anything to build robust programs once they get out. My theory is, and I've argued this, these people aren't widgets. You know, they're still going back into poverty. The unemployment rate today was announced 11.5% in California. I think it's 45% for African American men go back into poverty. The likelihood of them going out and then getting in trouble or having to be subsidized in some form or fashion, particularly since the governor wants to eliminate CalWORKs, is I don't know what the answer to that is. At some point, we have to change. This is my finishing thing about how we got into this mess. The state of California, the Constitution allows the legislature and the governor to have full control over 7% of the budget. 93% of it we as voters have put in place in formulas. So Prop 98 has a formula for education, protects education. 172 is a program for public safety. You pay an extra percentage on your sales tax. 58, Prop 13, we've got so many initiatives that all of those have been passed by the voters, us, put in the Constitution. So we, the legislature, have, depending on the language in the initiative, have limited ability to change them. So that's why and then the last part of this Winchester House, as I described, the Constitution of California. And what I say is, it's like a Winchester House. We keep adding rooms, and the rooms may not be a bad idea in isolation, but when you look at the whole architecture, they don't conform to the larger architecture. So we need to change that. We need to change the initiative system. So we get in this battle over the 7%, or what's the easiest to move. So the discussions right now are how do we pass a budget without suspending Prop 98, which would have education fall even lower. And you're right, we're now 49th out of 50 states. In some categories, we are 51st, meaning we're behind the District of Columbia as well. So this is really great news. I'm sorry to spoil your weekend. But within all, but that's why that 7% is so fungible. So what's in that 7%? Well, the Correctional Department, the University of California, the California State University, community colleges, they have none of these formulas protecting them. So that 7% becomes more fungible. And within that 7%, the really key part that's even more disturbing than what you saw was, if everything else is going down, because that's the place you can get savings, or you're charging people more fees at community colleges and CSUs and UCs, and then exponentially the corrections department is going out, because that's one of the fungible places. That's where we really fight over things that we can fight over. And then lastly, the political problem. So we need to change the architecture of California. I'll be happy to come back and talk about constitutional reform. I could bore you for hours about that. because it's part of the whole. All of this is connected. So when you look at the simple analysis of here's corrections, here's the budget going up, here's education, and the budget's going down, and performance is going down. Here's corrections is failing in terms of its mission is actually to protect the public. And we're actually taking people, as I said, I was in a, before something else interrupted my life that I won't talk about here, I was going to go to each one of the facilities and see it as chair of this committee since I could ostensibly control their budget. And San Quentin I've been to twice, and then I went to Dual, which is a 7,000-bed transitional facility in Tracy. It was built in 1952, named after a state senator. Not something I want to do. And it was, you know, it's just an amazing
Maybe the
experience
exit door.
in these facilities. Standing in that facility, spending most of the day there, I couldn't believe that I was in the United States of America. I couldn't believe that I was in California. I mean, this is not the kind of place you see in the movies in terms of being modern. It's an amazing place. I mean, as a transitional facility, there's 7 of these in the state. So the buses come in when people come out of county jail, and they take them in and process them, and people are in cages. If you have to be isolated, you're in a cage, basically isolated physically by yourself. If you want to sit down, the cage is actually so you can't stand up. And then the officers who process them, which is quite inefficient if you ask me, they go through this interview that basically is asking about their gang affiliations so that they're also required by some court decisions to segregate people so they don't hurt one another. So these officers are trying to find out what their gang affiliations are, so that they can assign them in this transitional facility so they won't get hurt.